There is a version of exhaustion that doesn't show up on any medical chart because it isn't caused by too little sleep or too much work. It's caused by too many years of being the one who's fine, the one everyone calls when things fall apart, who somehow always finds the calm, practical thing to say while their own hands are shaking under the table. If you've ever sat in your car after holding everything together for someone else and felt a wave of something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger but sat somewhere heavy in between, you already know the feeling this video is about. Not weakness. Something closer to a low, persistent hum beneath your entire life. The sound of a system that has been running without rest for so long it no longer remembers what rest feels like. You've been told, probably more times than you can count, how strong you are. What almost no one has ever asked you is how much that strength has actually cost. We treat strength as a fixed trait, something you either have or don't, like eye color. But strength, the kind that shows up in real people's real lives, isn't a trait at all. It's a resource, drawn from a finite well, and the people who seem the strongest are often simply the ones who've learned to draw from that well without ever letting anyone watch the water level drop. This is the first uncomfortable truth hiding inside a phrase people offer as a compliment. You're so strong. What they usually mean is, you've made your suffering so invisible that I never had to witness it, and somewhere along the way, you may have started to believe that invisibility itself was the strength, rather than the exhausting performance sitting underneath it. Carl Jung offers a place to begin that reframes the entire question, because he understood that the traits we perform most consistently for others often become the traits we lose the most contact with in ourselves. Jung called this outward-facing identity the persona, the socially rewarded mask assembled from whichever qualities earned safety, approval, or usefulness. For a certain kind of person, usually one who learned early that their own needs were an inconvenience, the persona that formed wasn't charm or competence in the ordinary sense. It was composure, unshakable, endlessly available composure. And composure, once it becomes the entire architecture of your identity, doesn't just get performed occasionally. It gets performed constantly, including in the moments when the person wearing it has nothing left to give. Picture a child, maybe 9 or 10, in a household where an adult's emotions were the main event and everyone else's feelings were expected to accommodate them. Maybe a parent's anxiety filled every room they entered. Maybe a sibling's crisis consumed the family's attention so completely that ordinary complaints, a bad day, a hurt feeling, simply had nowhere to land. That child learns, with startling speed, an extraordinarily specific lesson: needs are a luxury other people get to have. And so the child becomes competent instead, reliable, the one who doesn't need managing. Because managing was never available in the first place. This isn't a personality trait forming naturally. It's an adaptation forged under real pressure, and like most adaptations formed under pressure, it doesn't ask permission before continuing to run for the rest of that person's life. Psychologists have a specific term for a version of this dynamic: parentification. The process by which a child takes on emotional or practical responsibilities that belong, developmentally, to an adult, often because the actual adults in the house were unable to carry them. A parentified child doesn't just help out more than other kids. They develop an entire internal operating system oriented around anticipating what others need before those needs are even voiced. Because in their original environment, waiting to be asked was a luxury that led to being overlooked. that system is remarkably effective. It produces adults who are extraordinary in a crisis, deeply attuned to the emotional temperature of any room they enter, and almost pathologically unable to locate their own needs inside all that attunement. Because the entire system was built to prioritize everyone else's signal over their own. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what this adaptation does to your relationship with your own limits, because it doesn't just make you capable, it makes you nearly incapable of noticing the exact moment you've exceeded what you can actually sustain. Neuroscience offers a precise physical explanation for why chronic strength eventually produces a very specific kind of collapse, one that often looks nothing like the dramatic breakdown people expect. Researchers studying chronic stress use a term called allostatic load, the cumulative where a body and brain accumulate from operating in a heightened, vigilant state over long stretches of time. Even when no single moment of that time felt like a crisis. Unlike acute stress, which spikes and then resolves, allostatic load builds quietly, invisibly, one manageable difficulty stacked on top of another, until the cumulative weight starts to affect memory, immune function, decision-making, and mood in ways that have nothing to do with any single event and everything to do with years of never fully powering down. This is why so many chronically strong people describe their exhaustion as confusing rather than dramatic. Nothing catastrophic happened today. It's simply that today was one more day added to a debt that's been accumulating for a very long time, and debts, financial or physiological, eventually come due, regardless of how competently they've been managed. Think about the last time you found yourself crying over something genuinely minor, a spilled drink, a delayed email, a small inconvenience that would barely register on an ordinary day, and felt confused by the disproportion of your own reaction. That confusion usually leads people to the wrong conclusion, that they're overreacting or losing control or somehow broken. What's actually happening is closer to a system finally registering a debt that's been quietly accruing for years, using the smallest available trigger simply because it's the first moment the pressure found an opening. The tears were never really about the spilled drink. They were about every moment before it that didn't get to produce any visible reaction at all. Each one deferred. Each one absorbed silently until the accumulated weight finally exceeded what a minor inconvenience could reasonably contain. Watch closely the next time you're offered help and notice your own reflexive response before you've even consciously decided how to answer. For many chronically strong people, the instinct to decline arrives faster than conscious thought. A reflex so automatic it feels less like a choice and more like a physical law. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because that reflex isn't modesty, and it isn't independence in the way people usually mean the word. Alfred Adler believed that a significant portion of adult behavior is organized around the specific way we learned, early and often unconsciously, to secure our place in a social world. For someone who learned that their value came from being useful rather than simply being present, accepting help doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a threat to the only identity that ever reliably earned them love or safety. Declining help isn't strength in this context. It's the preservation of a role that has become so tightly fused with self-worth that abandoning it, even temporarily, even for something as small as letting someone else carry a bag, feels genuinely destabilizing. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of all this competence, though, and it explains why the people who seem the most capable in a crisis are so often the same people quietly falling apart the moment no one is watching. Most people believe that being the strong one in a family or friend group is simply a description of temperament. Some people are naturally steadier than others. In reality, hyperindependence, the pattern of refusing help even when it's genuinely needed and genuinely offered, is increasingly understood by researchers studying attachment as a specific adaptive response, one that often develops when early caregivers were inconsistent, overwhelmed, or unavailable in ways that made depending on anyone else feel fundamentally unsafe. A child in that environment doesn't conclude that people are untrustworthy in the abstract. They conclude something far more personal and far more limiting, that they, specifically, must never again be in a position where their well-being depends on someone else showing up. This conclusion, formed years before the person had any conscious say in the matter, becomes the invisible architecture behind an adult who can organize a funeral, manage a crisis at work, hold a devastated friend together for hours, and still feel a genuine, bone-deep terror at the thought of simply admitting out loud that they're struggling. Evolutionary psychology offers a striking parallel for why this particular adaptation, once formed, proves so difficult to unlearn even in adulthood, surrounded by people who are, in fact, reliable. In many social species, an individual who experiences repeated abandonment or unreliable support from the group early in development shows lasting changes in how readily it seeks help later, favoring self-sufficiency even when cooperation would objectively serve it better, because the earlier experience recalibrated its entire model of what other members of the group can be trusted to provide. The mechanism isn't stupidity or excessive caution. It's a rational response to genuinely unreliable data, permanently generalized past the point where it remains accurate. The tragedy for a human raised this way is that the recalibration happened once, in a specific painful environment, and has been quietly running as though every subsequent relationship belongs to that same environment ever since. This is where the pattern deepens into something most people never fully see, because chronic strength doesn't just prevent you from receiving help. It slowly, quietly convinces the people around you that you don't need any, which means the exhaustion compounds not because no one cares, but because you've spent years training everyone in your life without ever intending to that your suffering doesn't require their attention. Behavioral psychology offers a blunt explanation for why this training works so effectively and so invisibly. People respond to the signals they're given, not to the truth beneath them. If every signal you've ever sent says I'm fine, capable, handling it, then the people around you, even the ones who love you deeply, will calibrate their attention accordingly, not out of neglect, but because you have consistently, competently, convincingly told them there was nothing here that needed their attention. This is one of the cruelest ironies of chronic strength. The more capable you become at hiding your exhaustion, the more thoroughly you eliminate any chance that someone might actually notice it without being told. Watch closely what happens the rare times you do let a crack show. An unexpected sharpness in your voice, a moment of visible frustration you can't quite mask fast enough. People who know you as the strong one often respond to these rare cracks with visible alarm, sometimes with a kind of concern that borders on discomfort, precisely because your baseline has trained them to interpret any deviation as a genuine emergency rather than ordinary human variation. This reaction, meant kindly, often teaches the chronically strong person an unintended lesson that even small, honest expressions of struggle are disruptive enough to worry people, which only reinforces the original belief that composure is the only acceptable offering. The trap closes from both directions at once, your own conditioning telling you not to show strain, and the people around you, shaped by years of your reliability, reacting to any strain as something alarming rather than simply human. Here is where Stoic philosophy offers something that sounds, at first, like a contradiction of everything the Stoics are usually associated with. Seneca, so often quoted for his emphasis on resilience, also wrote extensively about the danger of a life organized entirely around appearing unaffected, arguing that a person who never allows themselves to feel or express difficulty isn't practicing virtue. They're practicing a kind of quiet self-erasure. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire that demanded constant composure from him publicly, still kept private writings where he permitted himself the full weight of doubt, grief, and fatigue, precisely because he understood that concealing those states from everyone, including yourself, doesn't eliminate them. It only removes your ability to consciously manage them. The Stoic ideal was never the absence of struggle. It was the disciplined, honest relationship with struggle, and somewhere in modern culture, that distinction got flattened into something closer to relentless, silent endurance, which the Stoics themselves would likely have recognized as its own kind of failure, not its highest form. Viktor Frankl's psychology adds something essential here. Forged under circumstances that make ordinary exhaustion look almost trivial by comparison, which is exactly why his insight carries such unexpected weight. Frankl observed that even in conditions of extreme suffering, the people who endured most sustainably weren't the ones who denied their pain, but the ones who found honest ways to hold it, often by allowing themselves genuine connection with others rather than facing everything in isolation. Frankl's framework suggests something the chronically strong person almost never considers, that admitting exhaustion isn't a departure from meaning, it can be one of the most meaningful acts available, because it requires trusting another person with the truth rather than protecting them, or yourself from it. The performance of endless capability isn't actually more meaningful than honest struggle. It's simply more convenient for everyone else. The next realization changes everything because it reveals that rest, for a chronically strong person, isn't primarily a logistical problem, something solved by clearing a weekend or taking a vacation. It's a psychological one, because a nervous system trained to associate usefulness with safety doesn't simply relax the moment external obligations disappear. It often becomes more anxious, not less, in the absence of something to manage, because stillness removes the exact mechanism that has always made this person feel worthy of belonging. Imagine sitting alone on a Sunday afternoon with genuinely nothing that requires your competence, no crisis to solve, no one waiting on your steadiness, and noticing instead of relief, a rising, unfamiliar discomfort, almost a sense of illegitimacy, as though you haven't earned the right to simply exist without producing or holding something for someone else. This isn't laziness catching up with you, and it isn't a character flaw surfacing. It's the exact shape of what Jung called individuation trying to happen, the slow, uncomfortable process of separating your actual self from the role you've spent a lifetime performing so well that you nearly forgot it was a role at all. The discomfort of rest, for someone built this way, isn't the absence of purpose. It's the presence of an old buried question finally getting enough silence to be heard. Who am I when I'm not being useful to anyone? This is where integration, Jung's term for consciously reclaiming the parts of yourself that got sacrificed to a role, becomes the actual work, and it looks far less dramatic than most people expect. It isn't a single cathartic breakdown followed by transformation. It's smaller and stranger than that. It's the specific discomfort of saying "I'm not okay" out loud to someone and not immediately following it with a joke to soften the admission. It's letting a friend sit with you in a difficult moment without managing their reaction to your difficulty. It's noticing the reflexive urge to decline help and, just once, pausing long enough to let it be accepted instead. None of these moments look impressive from the outside. All of them are, in their own quiet way, a direct renegotiation of the oldest contract you ever signed, the one that said your worth depended on never needing anything from anyone. There is a specific kind of relief that follows the first few times you manage this, one that rarely matches the relief people expect going in. It isn't triumphant. It's quieter, closer to something settling rather than something lifting, the sensation of a system that has been braced for decades, finally allowing a small portion of its weight to be shared. Most people who begin this work expect to feel weaker for admitting difficulty. What they tend to report instead, once they've moved through the discomfort of the admission itself, is something closer to a return, the sense of meeting a version of themselves that has been waiting, patiently and without resentment, for the performance to finally end. None of this resolves instantly, and it shouldn't be expected to. The old reflex, the instinct to reassure everyone else the moment your own difficulty becomes visible, will surface again, probably in exactly the moment someone finally asks how you're really doing. That reflex isn't failure. It's simply the old adaptation, still running the program that once kept you safe, gradually losing its grip each time you notice it and choose, deliberately, not to perform composure you don't actually feel. What changes first is never the fatigue itself. It's your willingness to let someone see it, and that willingness, small as it looks from the outside, is the entire difference between a strength that quietly consumes you and a strength that finally includes the honesty to rest. And this leaves you with the only question that actually matters, the one no productivity system or self-care routine can fully answer for you. If the strength you've spent your whole life performing was never really a choice, but a role assigned to you before you were old enough to refuse it, then what might it feel like to finally set it down, not because you've become weak, but because you were never actually given the chance to simply be human? If this kind of psychology, the kind that finally explains the exhaustion you've never quite had words for, is something you want more of, consider staying close. There's more of this coming, built for people who are tired of being told how strong they are and ready to hear something closer to the truth.